Chapter 1 screams before dawn. Darkness, not the comforting kind that comes with sleep, but the suffocating eternal blackness of a dungeon sealed beneath stone and silence. Then a sound, metal scraping against stone, slow, deliberate, the rasp of a blade being dragged across a whetstone, each stroke sharpening steel, meant for flesh. Somewhere in the void, chains rattle not violently, but with the weak trembling pull of someone who knows resistance is futile, a breath shallow, ragged, the kind that comes when hope has already left the body. But the lungs refuse to stop fighting. Footsteps echo down the corridor, heavy boots on cold flagstone. They stop just outside the cellar. Key turns. The door groans open and torchlight floods in, blinding, cruel, revealing a figure slumped against the wall. No crown now, no silks, no titles. Just a human being stripped of everything that once made them untouchable. The executioner enters without a word. He does not need to speak. His presence is the sentence. His tools are the verdict behind him. Other men follow, God's witnesses, perhaps a priest clutching a cross that will offer no salvation outside beyond the prison walls. The city's waking vendors are setting up stores. Children are playing in the streets. Life continues indifferent as it always does. But in this cell, time has stopped. The condemned royal is dragged to their feet. Their legs buckle, but rough hands hold them upright. They are led down a narrow passageway, up stone steps slick with moisture and centuries of fear. The light grows brighter, the air grows colder, and then voices, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. A crowd has gathered in the square, packed shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks for a better view. They've come to watch, to bear witness, to remember, because this death is not meant to be private. It is meant to be a message. The figure is pushed forward toward the scaffold, toward the instrument waiting at its center, toward the end that has been meticulously designed not just to kill but to destroy. Who was powerful enough to deserve such cruelty? 2. Blood makes kings. To understand why royals died this way, you must first understand what royalty meant. Not just wealth, not just power, divinity. For centuries across empires and continents, kings and queens were not considered ordinary mortals. They were chosen by God, or the God's anointed, blessed, touched by something beyond the reach of common flesh. Their blood was sacred, their word was law. To question them was to question heaven itself. And yet that same sacred blood could be spilled, not easily, not without consequence. But when a royal life had to end, it could not be ordinary, it could not be quick, it could not be forgotten. Execution was not punishment, it was ritual. It was theater staged in front of thousands, a performance designed to remind the world that even the divinely chosen could fall, that power, no matter how absolute, was fragile, that rebellion, betrayal, or even the suspicion of treason would be met with something far worse than death. It would be met with erasure. The great empires understood this instinctively, and Rome emperors who fell from grace were not merely killed. They were damnatio memoriae, their names chiseled from monuments, their faces scraped from coins, their very existence erased from history. In England, traitors were drawn and quartered, their bodies divided and displayed across the kingdom as a warning. In France, the guillotine became the great equalizer, severing noble heads with the same indifferent efficiency it used on peasants. But long before the guillotine, before the executioner's axe became a symbol of justice, there were older methods, darker methods, methods that took hours, sometimes days to complete, because the point was never just to kill. The point was to make sure everyone remembered. Kings knew this, queens understood it, rulers across history weaponized death, transforming it into a tool of governance. Fear was not a side effect, it was the strategy. A well-executed execution could prevent a dozen uprisings. A public display of suffering could silence dissent for generations. And so the scaffold became sacred ground. The executioner became a priest of state power. And the condemned royal or not became the sacrifice that kept the throne intact. But there was a cost, because every time a ruler chose cruelty over mercy, every time they turned death into spectacle, they planted a seed of resentment, of rage, of revolution, and those seeds, watered by blood, would one day grow into something unstoppable. When did justice become spectacle? Chapter 3: Crowns and Fear. Not all executions were equal. common thief might hang, a murderer might face the sword. But when royalty fell, when a prince, a queen, a duke, or a rival to the throne was condemned, the methods became something else entirely. They became art-twisted, grotesque, unbearable art, because killing a royal was never just about ending a life. It was about sending a message so powerful, so visceral, that it would echo through every noble house, every court, every throne room in the realm. This is what happens when you betray the crown in Tudor England. The word traitor was a death sentence wrapped in unimaginable suffering. Those accused of treason, especially those born into power, faced the infamous punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the phrase itself barely captures the horror. First, they were hanged until nearly dead, pulled down while still conscious, then, while their hearts still beat, they were cut open, their entrails removed and burned before their eyes. Finally, their bodies were hacked into quarters, each piece sent to a different corner of the kingdom, a warning in for directions. In Persia, emperors favored a slower, more intimate cruelty, scaphism. The boats was reserved for those who had betrayed the throne with particular treachery. The condemned was stripped naked, trapped between two small boats or hollowed logs with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. They were force-fed milk and honey until their bowels released uncontrollably. Then they were left in the sun, covered in their own waste, as insects burrowed into their flesh. Death took days, sometimes a week. The Ottomans preferred impalement, a method popularized by Vlad Dracula, but refined across the empire. A sharpened stake was inserted through the body, carefully positioned to avoid vital organs, ensuring the victim lived for hours, sometimes days, displayed upright as a monument to what happened when you defied the Sultan in Ming Dynasty China. Death by 1,000 cuts, lynchy, was the ultimate sentence for those who committed crimes against the imperial family. The executioner was trained, precise, methodical. Each slice was calculated to maximize pain. While delaying death, the body was kept alive as long as possible, consciousness preserved through the agony, so that the condemned could feel every moment of their unraveling. These were not acts of rage, they were policy, because fear, when wielded correctly, was more powerful than any army. A single execution, brutal enough, public enough, could prevent a civil war. It could crush a conspiracy before it even began. It could remind every noble, every general, every ambitious cousin of the king that the price of ambition was not exile or imprisonment. It was annihilation. Mercy was a luxury monarchs could not afford. Compassion was a weakness that enemies would exploit. And so across empires, across centuries, the ruling class perfected the machinery of terror. If fear keeps order, how far is too far? Chapter 4, Accused of Treason. The word treason is a curse. It doesn't need proof, it doesn't need evidence, it only needs a whisper, and once that whisper reaches the throne, it becomes truth. Throughout history, the most dangerous place to be was not on the battlefield, but in the palace, surrounded by family, surrounded by allies, because in the shadow of the crown everyone was a potential threat. Every smile could hide ambition, every conversation could be twisted into conspiracy. Paranoia was not a flaw of kingship, it was a survival mechanism, and it devoured princes, queens, and nobles with ruthless efficiency. Take Anne Boleyn. Once she was the woman who changed England forever, the woman Henry VIII defied the Pope, for tore his kingdom apart, for reshaped an entire religion, for she was Queen of England, mother to the future Elizabeth, untouchable at the height of her power, until she wasn't, when she failed to produce a male heir. Henry, as passion curdled into suspicion, courtiers whispered, rivals circled. And within months, Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges so absurd they barely warranted a trial. That she got one anyway, a sham trial with a predetermined verdict. She was beheaded on Tower Green. A French swordsman was brought in specifically for the occasion, because Henry wanted her death to be merciful, a single clean stroke, as if mercy could erase what had been done to her. Or consider Alexei Petrovich, son of Peter the Great, born into the most powerful dynasty in Russia. Alexei should have inherited an empire. Instead, he inherited his father's suspicion. Peter, obsessed with modernizing Russia, saw his son as weak, traditional, a threat to his reforms. Alexei fled the country, seeking asylum abroad, but Peter was not a man who forgave. He lured his son back with false promises of reconciliation, then had him arrested, tortured, and interrogated. Alexei was accused of plotting against his father, a plot that may never have existed outside Peter's paranoid imagination. He died in prison officially from his injuries, though many believed he was quietly executed. Either way, the message was clear. Not even blood could protect you from the throne's wrath. And then there were the princes in the Tower. Edward V and his younger brother Richard disappeared into the Tower of London in 1483. They were children 12 and 9 years old, placed there for their protection by their uncle Richard III, who swiftly claimed the throne for himself. The boys were never seen again. Centuries later, workmen discovered 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase in the tower. The remains were never definitively identified, but history had already made its judgment. The princes had been erased, not with a trial, not with a public execution, with silence, because sometimes the cruelest executions were the ones that never officially happened, the ones where the accused simply vanished. No scaffold, no crowd, no record, just an empty room and a kingdom that moved on. Treason was a trap. Once accused, the outcome was almost always the same. Confessions were extracted through torture, witnesses were coerced, or bought. Trials were performances, their verdicts written before the first word was spoken. Innocence was irrelevant, because the crown did not exist to protect the truth, it existed to protect itself, and anyone who threatened that through action, through ambition, or simply through existence would be removed, quickly or slowly, publicly or privately, but always permanently. Once accused, was survival ever possible? Chapter 5, Instruments of Pain. The scaffold was never empty. It was a stage, and the instruments waiting there were stars, not weapons were not tools of defense, machines, devices, inventions, designed with a single horrifying purpose: to make death last as long as possible while ensuring the condemned remained conscious for every unbearable second. These were not acts of spontaneous violence. They were engineering. Let's begin with the breaking wheel. Also known as the Catherine wheel, it was a favorite in medieval Europe, reserved for those whose crimes demanded prolonged suffering. The condemned was spread across a large wooden wheel, their limbs stretched and tied to the spokes. Then the executioner took an iron bar and methodically shattered every major bone in the victim's body, starting with the fingers, moving to the wrists, elbows, shoulders, then down through the legs. Each strike was deliberate, precise. And when the breaking was done, the victim, still alive, still breathing, was left on display, their shattered body woven through the spokes of the wheel like a grotesque wreath. Death came from shock, dehydration, or exposure. Sometimes it took days. Then there was flaying, the removal of skin while the victim still lived. It sounds impossible. Surely the body would shut down. Surely death would come quickly. But skilled executioners knew how to keep someone alive through the process. They started at the extremities, peeling skin away in strips, avoiding major arteries. The pain was beyond description, nerve endings exposed to open air, raw flesh screaming with every breath, every movement. Victims sometimes lived for hours in Assyria. Flaying was a mark of the empire's might. Reliefs carved into palace walls depicted the process in brutal detail, showing prisoners being skinned alive as kings watched from their thrones. The skins were then displayed as trophies or even used to decorate the walls of conquered cities, a reminder. This is what happens to those who defy us. Boiling alive was another method reserved for the highest levels of treachery in England. During the reign of Henry VIII, a cook named Richard Roos was accused of poisoning a meal. His punishment? To be lowered into a cauldron of boiling water and cooked alive. The execution took place publicly, with onlookers describing his screams as inhuman. The practice continued sporadically across Europe, with variations: sometimes oil instead of water, sometimes the condemned was placed in the cauldron cold, and the heat gradually increased, prolonging the agony. And then there was the pear of anguish, a small, deceptively simple device shaped like a pear, made of segmented metal. It was inserted into the mouth, vagina, or anus, depending on the nature of the alleged crime. Then a screw was turned, and the segment slowly expanded, tearing flesh, breaking teeth, rupturing internal organs. It was not designed to kill, it was designed to mutilate, to destroy the body from the inside while leaving the outside intact. But perhaps the most notorious of all the method that has become synonymous with medieval horror was drawing and quartering, reserved almost exclusively for those convicted of high treason. It was a multi-stage execution designed to obliterate not just the body, but the very concept of identity. First, the condemned was dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, sometimes for miles, ensuring maximum public humiliation. Then came the hanging, but only until near death, never completion. The victim was cut down while still conscious and laid on a table, then the disembowelment. The executioner sliced open the abdomen and slowly pulled out the intestines, often burning them in front of the victim's eyes. The heart was removed next, held aloft for the crowd to see. Only then was the head severed. Finally, the body was hacked into 4 quarters, each piece sent to a different region of the kingdom, displayed as a warning. There was no grave, no burial, no rest, just pieces of a person scattered and forgotten. These methods were not anomalies. They were not the work of madmen. They were official, legal, sanctioned by crowns, blessed by churches, witnessed by thousands. They were how empires maintained control, which method was reserved for the highest born. Chapter 6. The breaking body. Before the execution came the breaking not of bones, though that would come later, but of will, because the final hours of a condemned royal were not spent in silence. They were spent in a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological destruction, designed to ensure that when the moment came the victim would be compliant, broken, obedient, even if they had once won a crown. The cell was always cold, always damp. Light, if it existed at all, came through cracks too narrow to offer hope. Food was scarce, often spoiled, sometimes withheld entirely. Sleep was impossible. Guards made sure of that, banging on the walls at irregular intervals, shouting, dragging chains across the floor. The body weakened first, then the mind followed. Priests arrived frequently. They spoke of salvation, of redemption, of the importance of confession. But their true purpose was not spiritual, it was political. A confession, even a coerced one, legitimized the execution. It allowed the crowd to claim that justice had been served, that the condemned had admitted their guilt before God and man. Some resisted, others, worn down by exhaustion and terror, gave in. And Boleyn, in her final days, was reportedly calm to calm, as if she had already left her body, already accepted that nothing she said or did would change her fate. She asked only that her execution be swift, and that the swordsman be skilled. Henry granted her that much, but not everyone was so composed. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, was only 16 when she was led to the scaffold. She had been a pawn in a political game she never wanted to play, thrust onto the throne by ambitious men, then discarded the moment she became inconvenient. In her final moments, blindfolded, she panicked. She reached out, searching for the block, unable to find it. What shall I do? Where is it? She cried. A guard had to guide her hands to the wood. She was beheaded seconds later. Some prisoners were tortured before their executions, not to extract information, but simply to ensure they arrived at the scaffold. Already destroyed, Guy Fawkes, before his execution for the gunpowder plot, was subjected to the rack. His body was so broken by the time he reached the gallows that he could barely stand. When he was hanged, he managed to jump from the ladder, breaking his own neck, denying the executioners the chance to disembowel him alive, a final act of defiance. Others tried to bargain, promised wealth, offered secrets, begged for exile instead of death. The crown rarely listened, because the decision had already been made. The crowd had already gathered, the executioner had already been paid. There was no turning back, and so in those final hours, the condemned royal was stripped of everything: titles, dignity, hope, reduced to flesh and fear. They were led from the cell up the stairs into the light. The crowd roared, the executioner waited, and history prepared to forget them. What happens when the crowd arrives? Chapter 7 Death, a spectacle. The square was packed, thousands of faces pressed together shoulder to shoulder, climbing onto walls, hanging from windows, children hoisted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view. They had come from across the city, some from across the country, because this was not just an execution, this was an event. The scaffold stood at the center, raised high enough that even those at the back could see, draped in black cloth, sometimes bearing the royal crest, a grim reminder that this death was sanctioned, official, righteous. The executioner stood ready, masked or hooded, anonymous, a living symbol of the state. As power in his hands, the instrument, an axe, a sword, a rope, depending on the method chosen. And then the condemned arrived. Sometimes they were dragged, sometimes they walked. A few, very few, held their heads high, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing them broken. Mary, Queen of Scots, wore red beneath her black gown when she was led to her execution, red, the color of martyrdom. She forgave her executioners, prayed aloud, and laid her head on the block with her arms outstretched as if embracing her fate. It took 3 strikes to sever her head. The first blow missed, hitting the back of her skull. The second cut through most of her neck, but failed to fully detach the head. The third was more of a sawing motion, finishing what the axe could not. When the executioner lifted her head to show the crowd her lips were still moving, Charles I of England, on the other hand, insisted on wearing 2 shirts to his execution. It was a cold January morning, and he did not want the crowd to mistake shivering for fear. He spoke briefly, calmly, and then knelt before the block, one clean stroke. The crowd silent until that moment erupted, some in cheers, others in horror, many rushing forward to dip handkerchiefs in the royal blood, believing it held power. Not all executions went smoothly. The Duke of Monmouth, a legitimate son of Charles II, faced one of the most botched beheadings in English history. The executioner, Jack Ketch, struck 5 times and still failed to sever the head completely. In the end, he had to finish the job with a knife. The crowd, furious, nearly rioted, because even in death there were standards, expectations. A royal execution was supposed to be efficient, clean, a demonstration of the crown's power and control. When it went wrong, it became something else. A grotesque failure that undermined the very authority it was meant to reinforce. But whether smooth or botched, the result was always the same. The body was removed, the scaffold was dismantled, the crowd dispersed, and the throne remained. Did these deaths secure the throne or doom it? Chapter 8 After the blood dried. The executions were meant to end the threat, to silence dissent, to crush rebellion, to remind the world that power was absolute. But blood has a memory, and history has a long reach. Within a generation of Anne Boleyn's death, her daughter became Elizabeth, one of the greatest monarchs England ever knew. The woman Henry killed to secure his legacy ended up defining it. Charles I's execution did not save the English Republic. Within years, the monarchy was restored, and those who signed his death warrant were themselves hunted down and executed. The Romanovs believed their power was unshakable, that divine right would protect them forever. Then came 1918. The entire family, Tsar Nicholas to his wife, his children executed in a basement, their bodies burned and buried in unmarked graves. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries erased in a single night. Terror, it turned out, was not a foundation, it was a fuse. And every brutal execution, every public display of cruelty, every body left to rot as a warning. They all fed the fire until one day the fire consumed the throne itself. Did history forgive them? Chapter 9 Echoes of the Scaffold. We like to believe we've moved beyond this, that we're civilized now, enlightened, that the scaffold is a relic of a darker age. But have we really changed? Or have we simply learned to hide it better? Public executions still happen, live stream beheadings, assassinations broadcast on the news, political prisoners disappearing into black sites, their fates unknown. The methods have evolved, the technology has improved, but the principle remains the same: fear as governance, death as message, cruelty as control. The scaffold is gone, but the spectacle remains, and somewhere in a palace or a bunker or tower far from here, someone is making a list of names, of threats, of people who need to be reminded what happens when you challenge power. History doesn't repeat, But it echoes, and if you listen closely, you can still hear the screams. If fear once ruled the world, are we really free from it now?